And, you know, a friend Albert always used to say, and Buckminster Fuller too, you cannot solve the problem from the level of the problem. Paraphrasing, obviously, the challenge, unless you can step out of 3D form-focused world and trying to manipulate the chess pieces for a regenerative life in that world, you are still subject to the rule set of that world, and you're as doomed as anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean to be cavalier about that.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament Podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Today we'll be looking at advanced practices in both personal development and community building with Pamela Boyce Simms, who calls herself an evolutionary culture designer and calls her own blog Buddhist-Quaker. Let's look into some deep practices with Pamela Boyce Simms. All right. Welcome to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament Podcast. It's an extraordinary time. Here for the past 5 years or so, I've been saying that quite often, but I really mean it this time. Just in the past few weeks, there are elements at play in our world that I never could have imagined. And I'm really moved by being in touch with our guest for today, Pamela Boyce Simms. A good friend of mine recommended that I check out Pamela's writing and her unique combination of blend of influences and focus for her attention. For instance, her blog is called Buddhist-Quaker, Facilitating Evolutionary Culture Design. Remarkable writings, and we'll of course put all of Pamela's contact information in the show notes for today. But I'd like to first just introduce Pamela. I'm going to introduce you, if I may, from the Resilience website, their brief bio of you. Pamela Boyce Simms is an evolutionary culture designer who convenes the Mid-Atlantic Transition Hub, MATH, a 6-state network of environmental activists. She's a veteran of local, regional, and national resilience building with the transition environmental movement, and currently works with international Quaker, Buddhist, and African diaspora earth care networks. I know that's a lot, and something tells me that, Pamela, that's barely scratching the surface of what you bring to this conversation. I've had the pleasure of reading a few of your pieces on your blog and in Resilience, and I'm already just feeling the resonance with what my friend was suggesting that I might find in reading your work. It's really a pleasure. I so appreciate you taking the time. I know that you keep yourself very engaged and very full schedule going on. So thank you so much for taking this time to speak with us. And I'll just tell you now that it's really my desire to bring you here was to bring what looks to me to be an extraordinary blending of emphases what's important to you and how you blend it together in both your blog and evidently with the various organizations that you're a part of. It's extraordinary, and I think it's really needed in these times, because the more traditional ways of organizing ourselves, and even how we put together articles and speak with each other, we need new blendings, and perhaps new blendings of sacred or long-standing wisdom traditions, which I think you bring. So again, thank you, Pamela, for being with us. And if you would just say hello to the folks, and please add anything I may have left out in welcoming you.
I am just delighted to be with you today, Dean, and really appreciate the invitation.
All right. Well, that I love your demand for some focus for our conversation today, and I've just laid out 3 pieces that were my first response to your request, and I'm wondering if any of the 3 particularly ring your bell, and you'd like to start there. If you don't have one, I'm really curious. How is this world showing up for you? What's emerging for you in your experience as you look out into this world that we are experiencing now?
Well, it might be of help to provide some context, backdrop for the framework that, or the lenses through which I'm seeing the world, and the process that I and many other people are engaged in to most effectively and impactfully live in this world as it is. And that is a blending, bringing together ancient contemplative practices, which we then hone and sharpen with cutting-edge neuroscience. And that is all in the context of a quantum understanding of the world. So what that means in a nutshell is the fact that science has finally come full circle to where the Vedas and the Upanishads were 5,000 years ago, where Siddhartha Gautama Buddha was 2,500 years ago, that we see in the sutras, where George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, was 370 years ago, Taoists, Vedantic Hindus, folks that have been understanding the world in a conventional sense and simultaneously in a non-material, ultimate sense for thousands and thousands of years, who have always been on the periphery of discourse. Now science has finally gotten to the space where the Vedas were 5,000 years ago. So it looks like if you want to jump in there, that's the pith of it, the core of it, in terms of looking at what is occurring from the perspective of non-materiality and the fact that we are multi-dimensional beings. One of the frequencies or bandwidths, so to speak, that we function at is the material, apparently more particulate matter frequency that you and I are speaking with today. But we are multidimensional beings, and the degree to which we can tune into, align with, and be awash in guidance and understanding from a much more expansive awareness of who we are is the degree to which we can understand what's going on, we can navigate what is going on, and we can potentize our activism and our intervention in what's going on from a vantage point of what we call parallel processing. It means being in the vehicle, being in the body, being in the matrix that we live in, the holographic video game that is our world, and simultaneously function at higher frequencies and be receiving guidance from ourselves at that higher frequency as well as the larger consciousness frame. So I'm going to stop there and ask you what's coming up for you, since the language is probably a bit different.
Yeah, the language it's actually familiar for me, but
great.
I'm curious if you could talk a bit about, because I'm just imagining that you end up being in groups a lot that do understand the words you're talking about, and that have a particular focus that they might have, a community group that has a desire to make a difference in that community in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, how does this remarkable kind of confluence that you've just been talking about, science and wisdom traditions and in an embodied sense of it and so on, these are exciting notions, but they're, for many people, kind of unusual. They're not something that many folks can easily put together into a sentence like you can. I'm curious, how's it going in terms of translating that for people who might be new in this group, for instance, that wants to make a difference in the community, if they're new to this particular, I don't know what you call your group, if it's a parish or,
Interesting choice of terms.
I don't know.
It's called Community Supported Enlightenment, for short, CSE, just like a CSA for when you get your agricultural products and your food products. This is a CSE, Community Supported Enlightenment Network. That's what we're calling it.
So if I'm a new person to this CSE, what might I experience that would start to immerse me in what you're describing?
Sure. I did a big zoom out there when I began to speak. So you got kind of a macro, expansive introduction to this. But there are what we call two pillars of what we do. And that is an understanding that we are not just material beings. And that's kind of the starting point where I started, that we are both particulate matter and we are non-local consciousness as well. And we can tap into self as consciousness as we simultaneously walk around and do what we have to do and buy our groceries and go to the store. That's the first pillar, some understanding that we are something far beyond the vehicle of the physical body. So that's pillar one. Pillar two is where a lot of people enter, and that is an understanding of neuroplasticity. The fact that, and that's what I mentioned, we're combining ancient contemplative practice, the stillness that allows us to access that more vast part of ourselves. We're combining that with a very sharply honed toolkit of neurolinguistic understanding of the brain, of neuroscience, and the ability to work with the neuroplasticity of the brain to actually get to the point using simulations, cultivating the internal landscape very methodically, very systematically. So the part of us that usually focuses on the 3D form-focused world and only what we can see with our five senses, using this toolkit, we can get that to stand down, to be still a bit, to tame that, so that we, and in so doing, we are rewiring the physiology of the brain. We're rewiring the circuitry of the brain so that thought, emotional, and behavioral patterns that do not serve us, that get in our way in our relationships, etc., but also get in the way of our understanding the vastness of who we truly are. We're using a well-honed toolkit to deepen neural nets, understanding the circuitry, the electronic circuitry of the brain, deepen neural nets that serve us, that empower us to be in touch with the more vast aspect of ourselves. And also, we're inviting to atrophy those circuits that get in our way, very practically in our relationships. In our relationships with our spouse and our boss and our siblings and people in the world. So it has a very practical application when we're using a neuroscience toolkit to rewire that circuitry. We are also simultaneously widening the pathway to a broadened understanding of ourselves as non-material beings walking around in material bodies. So a lot of people are walking through to these practices, through the process that we use, through the doorway of making their day-to-day lives better by mastering the circuitry that is tripping them up and learning how to rewire their brains so that they can function much better, more effectively, be better activists. And in so doing, also we then introduce the stilling, calming, deep contemplative piece, which could be simply self-observing when you're washing the dishes. It doesn't mean having to sit on a cushion for 3 decades in a monastery or make specific time for a practice. We call it living the meta life daily. It's a practice palette. So we take those contemplative practices, we combine them with a well-honed neuroscience toolkit that gives us access to a more vast part of our lives, and we completely infuse that into our daily lives so it's not having to go away on a 3-year retreat and sequester oneself or sit on a cushion every single day and do a meditation per se. It becomes metacognition is doorway number 1. And that can be developed as you're walking the dog, when the endorphins kick in, when you're on your morning jog. So we're using this as an infused daily palette of practices in daily life.
Oh.
Oh, okay.
Wow. Let me do my best to just get a little toehold in there, because you did say a lot. A couple of pieces that caught my ear particularly. It seems like across the board in what you were describing, you have a set of well-honed advanced self-regulation and co-regulation skills woven through each piece that you were just describing. And somehow you've teased out what sounds like the most useful of the current neuroscience to have a more articulated way of sharing and speaking with one another about the contemplative practices and what is occurring when you can take some of the insights, some of the experiences in a contemplative practice environment and translate that into daily action. So whereas before it might be telling stories, having it be kind of a metaphorical sharing, learning experience of it. Given you've got the neuroscience that's backing it up these days, you actually can spell it out with some remarkable accuracy.
Yes.
So
yes.
I'm just
yes.
curious, is any of that recap a fit, or have I missed some part of what I was just describing? Is there anything that you'd like to add to what I'm recapping?
You have really hit the nail on the head. What we are doing is using the cutting edge neuroscience understanding that our brains, the pia matter, the circuitry of the brain is like Play-Doh. It is like silly putty. It is like modeling clay. And when one is not examining one's life, the world, everything that is bombarding us, the good, the bad, the ugly, the healthy, the unhealthy, is just imprinting on that brain. So if we're not practiced at looking at how that imprinting happens and seeing what serves us and does not serve us, it is just an onslaught of material that is really, it could take it pulls us from pillar to post. And of course, as depending on whether you're a Montessorian or a Piaget child development aficionado, from 0 to 7 years old, there's not even any filter to keep out any of that stuff. There's somewhere between 7 and 9, depending on your child development specialist. The filters start to descend, and you can kind of buffer some of what's coming into your world and defend yourself psychologically and emotionally. But before that, whatever is lodged in there then attracts more. We were talking about trauma earlier before we started. A small, tiny trauma in the pia matter, in the circuitry, when you're from age 0 to 7, attracts to itself, because we're all about evolution, and the systems within systems that we are wants evolution to happen and growth to happen. So circumstances that mimic, that are similar to that original, even a tiny trauma when you were a kid that imprinted on the brain, will continually present themselves. You magnetize the same kinds of circumstances and the same kinds of people until it's as if the larger consciousness frame, or the more vast dimension of ourself, is saying, here's another opportunity to address this. Here's another chance to do it. Mm-hmm. So those traumas then build and build and build unto the point where we have the wherewithal to turn toward those traumas and address them and say, okay, I have a new way of doing that. So we are taking advantage of the plasticity of the brain and the current cutting-edge neuroscience tools to rewire those early traumas at any point in our lives, because also, as a function of neuroplasticity and the fact that we're working with the limbic system, which is the part of the brain that doesn't see linear time, we can actually go back in time. The brain doesn't know it, using internal simulations, which are very well honed to undo many of the most deleterious neural circuitry that doesn't serve us. So yes, we are taking tools that take maximum advantage of the plasticity of the brain to rewire trauma, rewire anything that is getting in our way of a deeper understanding of ourselves, to address fears in constructive ways where we hold them in a spacious way so that we can create a rapport, and then détente, and then dialogue, and then befriend, and fear from lots of different angles, so that again we are cleaning up the circuitry. We are deepening what serves us, and the tools that Buddhism and Taoism and Vedantic Hinduism and even Quakerism 370 years ago couched in mystical language and lyrical terms and poetic material. Neuroscience has cut to the chase, like a laser beam focus, taken the nuggets out of the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Sutras, and given us, on a silver platter, tools we can use understanding the neuroplasticity of the brain and the fact that we can work with the limbic system as opposed to the prefrontal lobe, which is linear thinking, and we can go back in time because the emotional brain, synonym to the limbic system, synonym for the chemical brain, synonym for the midbrain, is a part of the brain that doesn't see time in a linear fashion. Mm-hmm. I used to be a peak performance coach for tennis players and football players and mm-hmm. speech orators, and they'd sit in my office, and recognizing that we're working with the limbic system, not which is an intuition, subconscious, unconscious, emotional brain that sees kind of like we see in dreams. You see, in dreams, you see a hodgepodge of your early childhood. You may have snatches of scenes from your adolescence, from your teenage years, young adulthood, even the future, even though we don't recognize it as such. So we work with that part of the brain that doesn't know. If a tennis player is sitting in my office, his brain doing a simulation, using the toolkit we use, doesn't know whether we're playing the match over and over again, the perfect tennis match, or the perfect football game, or giving the perfect speech. The part of the brain we're working with doesn't know whether he's doing it in 2 weeks, whether he did it 5 years ago, whether he's doing it when he's sitting in my office. So he gets up, drenched in perspiration, with muscle fatigue, as if he's played 3 matches, 3 games. He's given that speech because we've worked with a part of the brain and rewired it so that it serves him that doesn't know. It's basically because of the plasticity and because we're focusing on the limbic system through simulations, the brain is taking what we give it with a lot of positive emotional intensity, using those tools to future pace his game. So when he gets to the court and he's going to play his match, he gets to the field and he's going to play the game. When he gets to the podium and he's going to give the speech, we've created future pace the neural networks in his brain for him to just step into it, because his whole being, physically, mentally, and emotionally, and at etheric levels as well, knows that game at its absolute best.
Yeah. It sounds like quite a bit of NLP in your background.
Indeed there is.
Yeah, that's great.
That was my early career with the peak performance coaching.
Yeah, I get it, definitely. You know, what comes to mind, if I may just share a little bit about some of the other guests that I often have here, they're really the focus last year and even more this year has been to speak with practitioners and actually teachers, coaches, mentors who are able to bring substantial bodies of work like what you're describing to others, and sort of unrelated. I also speak with people who are futurists or people who are designers of regenerative systems. And one of those guests comes to mind, a guy named Joe Brewer, quite a remarkable futurist, and he does exactly that. He designs bioregional regenerative human systems. And in the middle of one of our conversations, I asked him, so if a person would like to come to one of these experimental bioregional regenerative farm situations that you've created, if they wanted to come and they wanted to make a difference, if they wanted to contribute and learn about this new way for human beings to do the human operating system on the planet, something that is far more life-giving, how could they prepare themselves? What would be a good way for somebody to prepare themselves to come and be able to really chime right in, to be able to get right into the flow of what you're pointing toward? And he was quick to respond. He said two things. They'd want to have advanced self-regulation skills, and they'd want to have psychological flexibility. And I can't help but hear, obviously in extremely different language, my sense is that there's a tremendous amount of overlap in Joe's words and in what you've been describing. Of course, it's far more articulated in what you've been talking about. And he did say a little bit more, but I just want to stay with the nuggets of that. There seems to be a real scarcity of skill sets for the average person in both of those, in both having a psychological and a psycho-spiritual inner awareness of any of the dynamics you've been talking about. For most people, this is just like a mystery box where stuff happens. And then, unfortunately, it's also a very rare, in my experience, to find people who even know what the word self-regulation means, much less co-regulation, or how we might bring that to our families and communities and so on. So it seems like there's an overlap in these very different, I don't know, maybe they aren't all that different, the work that Joe does and the work that you do. Maybe there's more similarity than I know. But I found that resonance while you were speaking. And I'm curious if my having pointed out that resonance across a number of fields, if that sparks you to say anything, or if the emphasis on what appears to be kind of a lack in particularly in the USA, we don't seem to have much in the way of the rapport, the levels, multi-levels of rapport you were talking about just a couple of minutes ago, and how to generate that. That's an extraordinary skill, and it's literally on the other end of the spectrum from where we seem to be in our polarized world. So I've mentioned a few things here. I wonder if any of them has jumped up and caught your attention and sparked you to say anything.
I think the major point of departure where there is a chasm of divergence is the fact that most of the regenerative buzzword self-regulation kinds of approaches are focused predominantly, if not entirely, on the material particulate matter universe. And, you know, a friend Albert always used to say, and Buckminster Fuller too, you cannot solve the problem from the level of the problem. Paraphrasing, obviously, the challenge, unless you can step out of 3D form-focused world and trying to manipulate the chess pieces for a regenerative life in that world, you are still subject to the rule set of that world, and you're as doomed as anyone else. Mm-hmm. I don't mean to be cavalier about that, but it's what I'm saying here is that the first, where I started was an understanding of yourself beyond the physical vehicle. And that is not something that is inaccessible to John Q. Public, man in the street. All of us, well, the stat is is 80%, a little bit higher than 80% of people, have had some kind of mystical, numinous experience, whether it is in nature when you were looking into a pond and all of a sudden you saw 3 different dimensions of yourself, or you felt called by trees and in total connection and unity with the beauty of the mountainside or the waving meadow grass. Nature is one of the most profound producers of mystical experiences. People can walk through the door of something as simple as serendipity and synchronicity and what appears to be miracle that should not possibly have happened. When they've seen all manner of things that defy the rule set, the laws that govern this 3D form-focused particulate universe. So you ask me, how does John Q. Public enter this practice? And I went in the Joe Brewer direction in terms of being able to look at predominantly people walking around in Earth and in this reality frame called planet Earth here, and move those pieces around for everyone's well-being. That is a doorway, but I preface the comments by saying everything that I'm talking about here really has to do with being able to function in many different reality frames, the physical one being one of quadrillion. So I'm opening now the door to an understanding of yourself that is quantum, an understanding that there is only one unified, undifferentiated field. And I work with a whole bunch of different people across a spectrum of lots of different traditions. So I'm going to give you a few synonyms. I'm a non-theist, so I don't use many of these. I'm a Buddhist and a Quaker, a non-theist Quaker, a Buddhist Quaker. So I don't use many of these words myself, but as I'm dealing with people across a spectrum of traditions, I would say spirit, light, God, the divine, cosmic consciousness, the unified field, the undifferentiated field, the larger consciousness frame. Buddhists would say the difference between the conventional world and the ultimate. But there is one field, one quantum field, evolving and projecting one field of consciousness. I'm starting from the point of departure that particulate matter, atoms, cells, and electrons are not the building blocks of reality. Consciousness is the only fundamental reality. So the undifferentiated field, God, spirit, light, larger consciousness frame, quantum field, is projected into 7.5 billion bodies, plant life, animal life, in this reality frame in order to evolve. And the degree to which we can get with that program is the degree to which we can do regenerative anything. So self-regulation is just lovely, and doing wonderful work on farms is just lovely. Traditional psychotherapy, psychology, traditional practices that only deal with the energies, the field that is generated by the mind brain in the physical vehicle of what I call the avatar, the human being, is limiting itself to an infinitesimally small sliver of reality. So I zoomed out first, and then you invited me to zoom in. Zoom in is where Joe Brewer is, and I'm zooming back out now to say that really is the chasm of divergence.
Yeah, really clear, really well said. Thank you. Thank you. I'm not at all surprised. You know, there is one other methodology or tradition or lineage that I've been diving pretty deep into with regard to these podcast interviews in particular, but really in the formulation of the next generation of my own body of work. And that's there's a body of work created by Louise LeBrun in Canada, and she calls it well systems work, and has many of the same influences, particularly NLP comes to mind, that you've been talking about. And there are times when she or some of the folks that train her work, when they're speaking, it's very similar to what you lay out, especially when you go big. I think that's what you called it. So it's not an unfamiliar territory for me, and I'm really refreshed by both you and the Well Systems folks. There's I literally have lost count how many times I've used that same Albert Einstein quote of "We need a new way of thinking," and I've taken the poetic license to include, really all the dimensions that thinking being, and what Deb Ozarko might call activated presence. We need a different access to an entirely different way of experiencing and presencing ourselves in this life in order to address what's going on. So I'm completely delighted and engaged by what you've just been sharing. Thank you.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Yeah. So I hate to say it, but I can already feel the envelope of our time coming to a close, and I feel like we've just barely nudged the door open in the conversation. I'm curious if we could just shift gears a little bit to in asking you a bit more about your experience of particularly these times that we're in literally right now. I am noticing in myself that there are experiences at a scale that I've rarely experienced that are now happening multiple times a day. And that's in virtually every one of, in my particular jargon, we each have multiple bodies, and particularly in the energy body, I'm noticing, and for that matter, the emotional or the feeling body, I'm noticing huge waves of information, of experience washing through with what's going on. And I'm curious if you would share any part of what's it like to be you in these days, if there's anything that particularly is impressing on your system, if there's anything particularly emerging within you in light of what's going on. And
well,
is that too broad? And if it is,
no.
Okay, great.
No. Just to give you a bit of my trajectory that informs the perspective behind what I'm going to share in terms of what it is, how I'm seeing. My journey began with an understanding of the non-material with the Findhorn Garden in Scotland, and an understanding of how human collaboration with nature works, and then anthroposophy with Steiner, and theosophy, and a bit of Gurdjieff, and all through from the outset of anthroposophy and theosophy, which is H.P. Blavatsky and Colonel Alcott's theosophy. Buddhism was always there. Buddhism was always the undercurrent, because, as you probably know, H.P. Blavatsky and Colonel Alcott were the people who brought Buddhism to the West and translated my lineage, Karma Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism in particular, translated that for the American public first. So Buddhism was part of that tradition from the door. So all of that said, my awareness, it's not even an understanding because it has nothing to do with cerebral anything. My training and my awareness from the time I was about 14, and that was a really long time ago, has been to understand that we come here to this physical, we have chosen to be in embodiment at this time, and we choose to embody where we embody wherever we do over the course of many thousands of embodiments. So it's a definite choice to be here at this juncture because the opportunity to evolve is exponentially greater than it would have been in other times. So that said, there's an understanding that this reality frame, just the world, which, you know, it's very much a matrix. It is a hologram that, as the Vedas said 5,000 years ago, and now quantum science has let us in on. We come here to learn. It is a learning lab. And all of the challenges and the problems and the hellishness is for our learning and for our testing and for our overcoming and for our evolving. Each one of us got a little conference packet. Here's your embodiment this time, and this is what you need to work through. And that really is the perspective, being in touch with myself as consciousness. If, for example, you and I are radio transceivers, and if I turn the dial to particulate matter, Dean and Pamela talking, that's a very low frequency on the radio, and we have the capacity, given the central nervous system and what we know in terms of what's been out there for 5,000 years, the tools and techniques to turn the dial up on the particulate matter frequency band to be able to function at many different bandwidths and learn how to navigate those bandwidths even while still in particulate matter. That being said, coming into embodiment, as I said, the larger consciousness frame, the quantum field, projects consciousness into 7.5 billion bodies, including mine. I know that I'm here to be simultaneously aware of my multidimensional self at different bandwidths as I also am functioning in the world. And everything that's going around me, the gale force winds of climate change disruption and COVID-19 and the entire process is a test of the emergency broadcast system, which each one of us with our individual life packets for this embodiment will have an opportunity to engage and grapple with. So when you're standing in that, when you are constantly inviting yourself to stand in that metacognitive higher frequency, turn the dial up on the radio receiver that is you. You have a whole different vantage point, and you're not pulled from pillar to post and sucked into the drama of the vortex of the horror. You see it. You are empathically assist and compassionately assisting people who are completely form-focused, only looking at the particulate matter universe and caught up in the drama, extending compassion to them to the extent they can hear you and will receive it, and you can, but you have one foot in one reality frame, one bandwidth, and the other foot in one or more higher bandwidths that gives you a vantage point that facilitates you executing the conference packet you got for this embodiment to embody this time, facilitates and potentizes your activism because you're not swept up in the winds of the drama of the resistance and the hellishness everyone's fighting. You can see it for what it is. It is a supreme test to learn, evolve, and grow. So you're in it. you're not of it, and you can navigate at many different bandwidths, and it's just a question of enculturating yourself. And it's not something that only a few people can do, which is where Quakerism comes in, and George Fox and all those guys that knew that, that we can all defy the laws. We can all do what was perceived as miracles. It's a we have universal agency to be able to do this. It's just, and the only way that working with the neurocircuitry really helps is it gets us beyond the brain that is only designed to navigate one frequency, one bandwidth, the third dimensional bandwidth. It makes the brain, the executive function of the linear sequential brain stand down, so we can open ourselves to heart-brain coherence and move far beyond that to access higher bandwidths, so we are not battered about by what's happening here. We have a vantage point that allows us to be compassionate, empathic, extend ourselves, but not be sucked into the gale force winds of the tornado. We are in the eye of the storm, the still, calm, tranquil eye of the storm, seeing everything going on around us, but being able to interject and intervene strategically without being pulled into the drama of it, the eye of the storm.
Ah, gorgeous. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity for the chat.
Yeah, really, thank you.
You're very welcome.
I had no idea where we would go, as I most often don't have a clue where we're going to go in conversations like these. And I'm deeply inspired by your orientation and your ability to reframe and take us along with you through your articulation and your embodied articulation of what you're sharing. You're good at it, and I'm so glad to have met you. It's inspiring.
Ditto.
Yeah.
Right back at you, Dean.
Yeah. I hope against hope this is not our last time connecting. Much like what I was just describing with the body of work, the lineage from Canada, the Well Systems folks, who are all women, by the way, that's just how they do their work. This seems like a level of conversation, a level of transmission that is so important at this time, and unfortunately all too rare. So again, I just hope we get a number of more opportunities. There's a resonance and a warmth and an inspiration that I feel. And I just feel thankful for the connection made so that we could meet, and invite you to share your experience of what this life is about. Is there anything you'd like to say to kind of sign off?
Just to express my gratitude for you and the work that you do and this opportunity, and let you and your listeners know that the community-supported Enlightenment, the CSE, is open to all who resonate with anything that we've discussed today.
Can you say just a little bit more about how people can find you to the degree that you would like to be found, and then any of the other elements that you've been pointing to?
Certainly. The best way is just email directly to RobustResilientRemnant@gmail.com. RobustResilientRemnant. And the current blog spot is Buddhist-Quaker. And if you type in Evolutionary Culture Design, that'll bring it up quicker than just Buddhist-Quaker. We have a new. I also do environmental resilience building in terms of people growing plant medicine as well. So Singularity Botanicals website will be up very shortly at singularitybotanicals.com. That's coming on stream. But for what we're talking about today, Buddhist-Quaker is the best bet. But do email me at RobustResilientRemnant@gmail.com. And if you're interested in the community-supported Enlightenment Network, we'll set up a chat, an orientation conversation, and we work together online because we're all over the country and in a few other countries, meeting in groups of 2 to 5 people once a month. So the doors are open.
All right. You just mentioned about herbs, and from decades back, that's been a delight for me to keep a finger in for all these years. And I'm so interested in where you have taken it and what your involvement with the world of herbs is. So perhaps that's something we can touch into next time.
That's a whole other juicy conversation to have. Absolutely.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Pamela, thank you so much for taking this time out of your busy schedule and to show us just a brief glimpse of the extraordinary life that you're living and frame that you hold this life in. Thanks so much.
You're very, very welcome. It's been a pleasure, Dean. Thank you.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament Podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea.
Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching,
and sign up for our now weekly support gatherings online that we call Safe Circle.